Welcome, everyone. I'm Tom Davis, Senior Specialist for Social and Behavioral Change with the TOPS program. As I mentioned before, since we have a larger group, we'll not have all participants introduce themselves, but please type your email address in the chat box, and please remember to keep your microphone muted during this presentation until we reach the question and answer period, and then you can type into the chat box if you have a question, and we'll unmute your mic. The purpose of TOPS is to strengthen the capacity of Food for Peace grantees to deliver high quality and effective food aid by fostering collaboration, innovation, and knowledge sharing about improved food security and nutrition practices. A key output of the TOPS program was to form the Food Security and Nutrition Network. And so along with USAID's WASH and Nutrition Community of Practice, we at TOPS would like to welcome you to this event. I want to mention a few things I think everyone needs to keep in mind as we talk about environmental enteropathy and stunning today. And then I'll introduce our speakers. First, let's talk about why this matters, and Laura will expand on this later. We now know that improved WASH is associated with an increase of 0.1 to 0.6 height for age Z-score, about the same effect size as the very best infant feeding interventions. So the average improvement in height for WASH is about the best as the very best that we've achieved in infant feeding. I remember the first time I heard this that I was amazed and a bit skeptical. It didn't fit with what I'd always heard about WASH, and I considered WASH very in the backseat in terms of lowering stunning. But now we're learning that we need to give a lot more focus to WASH than we used to if we want to do something about stunting. And possibly not just stunning. In this study, it was a paper by DeBoer and others. It mentioned that in areas with poor sanitation, children experience vicious cycles of environmental enteropathy, and emerging evidence links child diarrhea and or growth failure with an increased occurrence of risk factors for cardiovascular disease later in life. So this could be important in the dual nutritional problems that we increasingly are seeing in some countries as well. Now, there's an old joke about a guy who was looking for his car keys in his garage when a neighbor stops by. And the neighbor helps him for quite a while to look for the keys, searching all over the garage, and then asks, "Are you sure you lost them in the garage?" And the guy says, "No, I'm pretty sure I lost them in the front yard." And the neighbor's a bit perturbed and asks, "Why are you looking for them in the garage?" And the guy says, "Because I usually lose them in the garage, and the light is so much better in here." I think sometimes we get too focused on particular areas where we expect to find solutions to problems because that's where we have found solutions in the past, and that's where we are used to looking for solutions. So I'm hoping that this presentation will enlarge the area where we look for solutions to stunning and help us realize the untapped potential of WASH interventions in lowering stunning. If everyone could mute the mic, I would appreciate it. So I think we need to take off our sectoral hats as we approach the problem of stunning and say, whatever is required, we need to do it. It may require us to learn some new skills, become a lot more fluent in other areas of research than we usually delve into. It might mean that we have to give a lot more emphasis to certain sectors than we've done in the past. And maybe it's not principally nutritional intake that we need to be focusing more on right now. Certainly, improved intake is definitely necessary, but is that the main thing that has been missing? And we now know from Pamela Serkan's meta-analysis that we could potentially reduce stunning by 23 to 29% by eliminating maternal depression. Who's working on that? So we need to be thinking about these other areas where we need to do more if we want to decrease stunning more than we've done so in the past. Now, it's easy when given new data to allow some of our heuristics to kick in, those shortcuts that our brains make that make it easier to make decisions. But that sometimes points us in the wrong direction. For example, the availability heuristic, that's a mental shortcut that occurs when people make judgments about the probability of events by how easy it is to think of examples. Maybe we can think of a lot of examples where we did something in nutrition or did something with supplements and we had a great result. So we don't think of WASH because we haven't done as much in WASH, but we need to look at the data. Or think of our tendency towards confirmation bias. That's our tendency to favor information that confirms our beliefs or our hypotheses, and then ignore that doesn't confirm what we already believe. So when we hear new information like what you're about to hear, you have to fight not to brush it aside, since it will not conform to what you've always heard. Keep an open mind during this and listen to what the data is telling us. I have the pleasure now to introduce our key speakers for today. First is Helen Petak. Helen works as a health advisor in the Maternal and Child Health Division at USAID. In this role, she supports partnerships and technical issues in WASH and indoor air pollution programs, as well as the analysis of life-saving pharmaceuticals for maternal and child health. She supports several initiatives to facilitate the analysis of data to support decision-making. And prior to joining USAID, Helen had a variety of academic positions and was a senior director of scientific affairs for SomaLogic, developing partnerships and technologies for medical diagnostics. She holds a PhD in chemistry from Cornell University. And I'll go ahead and introduce Laura as well, who will be speaking after Helen. Laura Smith is a PhD candidate in international nutrition at Cornell University. Her research focuses on the effect of mycotoxin exposure on maternal and infants' health. And in particular, she's interested in the mechanisms by which mycotoxins may negatively impact child growth. She won't be talking about mycotoxins on this call, though. She is conducting her research in Zimbabwe in the context of the SHINE trial, which aims to determine the independent and combined impact of improved sanitation and hygiene and improved infant feeding on linear growth and anemia in children. Laura received her BS in nutritional sciences from Cornell in 2007. She worked in community nutrition and behavior change research for several years before returning to graduate school. And Laura is also working with Rebecca Stutzvitz at Cornell, who is also on this call and may help with some of the questions. So at this point, we'd like to ask you to hold your questions until after our two speakers have presented. And I'd like to ask Helen to take it away. Thank you.
Good morning. I just want to welcome you to the first webinar of our Community of Practice. And perhaps one of the things that Tom just described is that we will need to work in cross-sectoral manners in order to solve some of the problems at hand. And the goal of the Community of Practice is to bring together practitioners with expertise in WASH and nutrition and thinking about food security problems, and bring those people together to try to solve these problems. One of the U.S. government initiatives that's relevant to this is the Feed the Future initiative, a global hunger and food security initiative with one focus area on improved nutrition. So as we consider moving forward with this Community of Practice, I'd like to thank Dan Campbell for his efforts in posting and classifying a number of relevant articles in this cross-sectoral space. I'd also like to invite you to add to this Community of Practice by sending your ideas to Dan Campbell, and we'd like to have a much more lively interaction. So it's an opportunity to put forward ideas about future webinars or ideas you have and how we might be able to interact together to be able to address some of the issues that face us in the WASH nutrition food security space. I just want you to know that we have been thinking about this for some time, and there are some programs already underway, one in Mozambique and one in Bangladesh, where we're starting to associate WASH programming with nutrition programs, and we hope there are many more initiatives moving forward. And what I'd like to do is leave this as only an introduction to the Community of Practice, but know that it's open and welcome for new ideas and new inputs, and turn it over to the technical discussion of the day. But thank you for joining us. So Tom, I'd like to turn it back to you so that you can initiate the technical discussion of the day.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. And we have told you about Laura Smith, and she will now be talking to you about environmental enteropathy. And following her conversation at that point, we'll be taking questions.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about environmental enteropathy, going beyond nutrition to understand child growth and development. And I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues here at Cornell, Rebecca Stoltzfitz, Francis Ngire, Bree Reed, and Gretel Pelto, as well as my colleagues at Chitambo, our research organization in Zimbabwe, Mduduzi Mbuya, Andrew Prendergast, and Jean Humphrey. And so next I'm going to go to
Laura, we might have lost audio there for a second, and if you could also speak a little bit louder, we're having a little trouble with your audio.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. Technical difficulties. I will continue. Stunting and environmental enteropathy, what we know and what we're trying to figure out. First, as most of you know, stunting is a problem around the world, a significant public health problem around the world, affecting about a third of children. It is important because it increases risk of mortality as well as cognitive deficiencies and causes loss in human capital.
Your browser.
Figure,
Interesting.
Cool. And they can't hear me, right?
I'm going to pause and check my mic settings.
I think you're fine, Laura.
Okay. This figure shows the growth trajectories from 0 to 59 months of age. The bottom line is the height for age z-scores, which is just a standardized height for age measurement. And what I want to point out first is that the children are born with an average height deficit of about 0.4 z-scores, and so they're born already too short, and they continue to falter dramatically until about 24 months of age, and that this height deficit is largely unrecoverable through later life. And so what this is showing us is that there is a small window of opportunity for improving nutrition from about 0 to 24 months of age, in which we might be able to prevent this growth faltering, this dramatic growth faltering. This leads us to ask, what is causing all of this stunting in children around the world? And so I'm going to talk about first the known causes of child stunting, and then introduce some of the work we've been doing on environmental enteropathy and the role that it may play in child stunting. The first known cause of child stunting is a malnourished mother. We know that malnourished moms give birth to babies that are smaller and shorter than normal. In Guatemala, about 50% of babies were born stunted, but around the world we have very little knowledge of the prevalence of stunting at birth because length data on newborns is not regularly collected and is pretty difficult to get. But in the most recent Lancet Nutrition series, they estimated that about 20% of later stunting has origins during the fetal period, leading us for an estimate about between 20 and 50% of stunting due to intrauterine factors. And at the same time, we lack effective macronutrient interventions for pregnant women to improve child growth in utero. So we don't have effective interventions in this area at this time. The second known cause of child stunting is a poor diet. The picture at the top here is a picture of porridge that around the world is regularly given to infants as a weaning food or a breast milk replacement food. And often as you can see in this picture, it lacks nutrient density and is definitely not a breast milk substitute. In a systematic review of the efficacy and effectiveness of complementary feeding interventions in developing countries by Dewey and Diarrhea, they reported that the best nutrition programs that we have show about a 0.7 increase in height for age z-scores, which is highly significant. But given that the average growth deficit in African and Asian children is -2, this 0.7 improvement is only about solving about a third of the problem. In the most recent Lancet Nutrition report, although the goal worldwide is to decrease prevalence of stunting by 40% by 2025, our current interventions are only going to get us about halfway there and reduce child stunting by 20%. So we still have to look at some other causes. The third potential cause of child stunting is diarrhea. the evidence for the effect of diarrhea on child stunting is less well established than the previous two causes, but we do know that children are having a lot of episodes of diarrhea during young infancy, estimate of an average of 9 episodes between the age of 6 and 18 months of age. And authors report that diarrhea accounts for anywhere between 10 and 80% of growth faltering, depending upon the context and the study. And other authors contend that children actually catch up between bouts of diarrhea and recover these deficits. This confusion about how much of diarrhea impacts child growth has led the Lancet Nutrition series to conclude that implementing sanitation and hygiene interventions with a 99% coverage to prevent diarrhea would only reduce child malnutrition by about 2.4%. But we do have evidence that the effect of WASH interventions on linear growth is independent of its effect on diarrhea. In several studies, WASH actually has a bigger effect on growth than it does on diarrhea. In 2 recent studies that were conducted in Peru, in which children were assessed for diarrhea and growth from birth to 2 years of age, and also household sanitation and water practices assessed, they found that while 16% of the height deficit at 2 years of age was explained by diarrhea, 40% was explained by the level of sanitation and water in the household. This has led us to ask how could WASH have an independent effect on child growth? One of my colleagues here at Cornell, Francis Ngire, conducted a study in which he looked at a household hygiene index that included cleanliness of mother's hands, child's hands, the compound cleanliness, as well as indoor cleanliness, into a scale, and found that in Ethiopia, this hygiene index was the variable that was most strongly associated with stunting in this context. And this graph is showing the higher the hygiene index is, which is the dirtier the household, the shorter the children are. Leading us to our discussion of environmental enteropathy. So if WASH has an independent effect on child growth that doesn't involve diarrhea, what could be causing this relationship between WASH and child growth? This picture on the right here, on the top right, is 2 pictures of cross-sections of guts. On the left is a cross-section of a healthy gut, and what you can see is well-differentiated villi with a lot of surface area for nutrient absorption. And on the right, you see a blunting of the villi tips as well as a thickening of the wall, reducing surface area, as well as increasing the space in which nutrients have to cross into circulation. And what you can't see in this picture, but is also characteristic of environmental enteropathy, is a increased permeability to large molecules in cells. This is likely caused by too many microbes in the lumen of the gut or the effect of toxins on the gut. And in combination, this condition causes a decrease in nutrient absorption as well as allowing infiltration of microbes into circulation. On this next slide, I have a cartoon picture of the gut to show this process. On the top, what you see is that all of the microbes as well as the immune cells are where they should be. The microbes are in the lumen of the gut. You have an intact barrier wall preventing these microbes from entering circulation. And inside you have plenty of macrophages and other immune cells to fight infection should the microbes cross into circulation. The picture on the bottom shows a leaky gut that's characteristic of environmental enteropathy and other enteropathies, in which there are small holes in the lining of the gut allowing microbes to enter circulation. And in combination, there's a decreased amount of immune cells to be able to fight these microbes, allowing these microbes to actually enter the bloodstream, causing a scenario in which there's chronic immune activation. And as you can imagine, when a child is experiencing chronic immune activation, they're diverting nutrients and energy away from growth to fighting infections. In our study in Zimbabwe, we have the following hypotheses that we are testing. The first is that environmental enteropathy is a major cause of postnatal stunting, anemia, and immunocompetence, and that environmental enteropathy can be prevented or reduced by preventing children from ingesting human feces through a package of interventions that improve sanitation and hygiene. And this hypothesis is based upon what we know about the gut, what we know about enteropathy and immune activation, as well as the hypothesis that the main cause of this enteropathy condition is ingestion of fecal matter. I'm going to briefly show you the causal pathway by which we believe that this ingestion of fecal matter and chronic immune activation causes child stunting and anemia. First, in a scenario where there's chronic immune activation, there's an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are cell signaling molecules stimulating inflammatory processes in the body. These cell signaling molecules upregulate hepcidin, which is the main regulator of iron metabolism in the body. And this upregulation of the hepcidin causes anemia because it decreases iron absorption and utilization. At the same time, this increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines leads to a decrease in insulin-like growth factor 1, which is a strong regulator of child growth and regulates the growth hormone in the body. And this downregulation of IGF-1 can lead to stunting. On the right-hand side here, I'm not going to talk very much about this pathway, but we also believe that this chronic immune activation can cause premature aging of the adaptive immune system and might lead to impaired response to vaccines and infections. So, given this hypothesized pathway, my colleagues in Zimbabwe went further to see if we could identify markers in the body that might explain this pathway. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Ander Prendergast, conducted a case control study with 101 stunted infants and 101 non-stunted infants to look for differences. In this figure, where I'm showing you the growth trajectory of these two groups of infants from birth to 18 months of age. On the bottom, you have the stunted group of infants, and on the top, you have the non-stunted group of infants. And what you see is that the stunted group of infants were born shorter than the non-stunted group of infants, and they continue to falter as they age to about 18 months of age, leading to almost a threefold difference in height between the non-stunted and the stunted infants, whereas the non-stunted infants are born normal and continue to grow normally throughout the first 18 months of age. And this indicates that there are systematic differences between these two groups of infants. So next, we looked at some markers of growth to see if there are differences between the stunted and non-stunted infants. This first figure looks at insulin-like growth factor 1, which is a protein and is a driver of growth hormone. And also, we also looked at insulin-like growth hormone binding protein 3, which is the binding protein that IGF-1 binds to. So in this first figure, what you can see is that the insulin-like growth factor 1 was systematically lower in the stunted infants at almost all time points from birth to 18 months. And I also want to point out the relative levels of IGF-1 in this Zimbabwean population The average levels in healthy European children range from about 54 to 170 nanograms per milliliter, and even our non-stunted infants are lower than that normal range, where the stunted infants are dramatically lower by 18 months of age, having IGF-1 levels of almost about 25. And you see the same pattern with the binding protein, in which it is lower in the stunted infants at all time points from birth to 18 months. This identification, and I'm just showing you a couple of the markers of systematic differences between stunted and non-stunted infants at the biological level, indicates that we might be able to change something in the environment to reverse these biomedical and biological differences, and leading us to work on developing a WASH intervention. And before I get into the WASH intervention, I just want to show this picture that captures an eating event at one of our very standard households, in which children are eating together from a shared bowl on the ground of the compound and being hovered over by 4 chickens and 1 dog ready to pounce on them. And so it's within this context that our goal is to not let infants ingest any feces between birth and 18 months of age. In 2008-2009, my collaborators in Chitambo conducted formative WASH research and did compound observations and interviews. The main finding during this WASH research was that sanitation in this context is highly valued, but that households often don't have a latrine because of the prohibitive cost of building a latrine. The cost of the approved toilet in Zimbabwe is higher than most can afford, and so they're not able to have a latrine, but that it's valued and that people would want that. Additionally, we found that infant stools are less offensive than adult stools, that although adults and children washed their hands, it was seldom with soap, and that infants were often fed cold leftover food. Following this research, my colleagues began to develop a WASH intervention that involved installation of toilets and hand washing stations, but then went back feeling that we really needed to conduct some more research. So in 2011, some of my colleagues conducted a baby observation study in which they went to people's households and observed children for 6 hours, recording how often things went into their mouth and whether it was dirty. And then they returned and collected samples of the most frequent and dirtiest things that went into the infants' mouths for microbial analysis. So what did they find? The most frequent thing that went into a child's mouth was their hands, an average of 38 times in a 6-hour period, and 75% of the time the hand was visibly dirty. The dirtiest thing that went into the mouths was soil, and this soil comprised of chicken feces and stones, and 3 of the children in our study population ate soil and ate quite a lot of it. They ate an average of 11 bites of soil. Now, this was news to us. We had not been concerned about children eating chicken feces up until now, and the majority of our WASH intervention was at preventing children from ingesting human feces, but it's not new to the literature. In a study in Peru in which households were selected for their ownership of poultry, infants ate an average of poultry feces, an average of 4 times in a 12-hour period. Whereas in our population in rural Zimbabwe, which we didn't select for poultry ownership, 3 out of 7 of the toddlers that were walking around ate chicken feces during this 6-hour period. And so in addition to sampling the chicken feces, we also sampled the laundry area where infants were often next to their mothers while doing laundry, so they spent a lot of time in this area, and it was damp, as well as just the compound, which, as you can see from this picture, there's bare soil and there's animal waste in the compound. The microbiological team here from Zimbabwe, here's a picture of them, went out and collected these samples. Francis and Gary, which a lot of the work I'm presenting today is his, is on the lower left-hand corner here, taking a break. And they took these samples back to the lab and tested them for E. coli. E. coli is an indicator of fecal contamination. And in this picture, you can see on the left, this is a sample that's highly contaminated with E. coli, and on the right, lowly contaminated with E. coli. So what did they find? The top two sources of contamination, infant food and drinking water, are traditionally thought of as vectors for fecal contamination in infants and adults. Well, what we found in this study is that none of the infant food samples were contaminated with E. coli. And while about half of the drinking water sources were contaminated with E. coli, it was extremely low amounts. And combined with the fact that infants don't drink a lot of water led to relatively low E. coli burden. The bottom two were really the problems in this population. Soil in the laundry area and chicken feces between 60 and 100% of the households had E. coli in these areas. And as you can see, the E. coli load was folds times higher than in the infant food and drinking water. And so clearly we must stop kids from eating dirt and chicken poop. And this is the first time that the chicken feces became a central part of our WASH intervention. So bringing back to the context in which we're developing this WASH intervention, these children are spending a lot of time by themselves and a lot of time on the ground, and the ground is contaminated with E. coli. This is the F diagram, traditional diagram that probably many people have seen, outlining the vectors by which fecal matter gets into people through fluids, fingers, flies, fields, and food, and identifying the main interventions to halt this contamination, including hardware interventions like toilets to improve sanitation, improving water supply, and improving hygiene practices. We visited this diagram, and after what we learned from our baby observation study, added some additional vectors and additional interventions for babies. This study really showed us that infants are living in very different microenvironments than adults, and so the interventions that are required to prevent them from being contaminated from their environment are different than the ones that we traditionally use for adults. And in this new F diagram for babies, we've identified that chicken feces is an important source of contamination, as well as the dirty laundry water from nappy handling and throwing the water out into the dirt, and then that children are actually eating the dirt from the ground. And one additional intervention that has been identified through this work is that infants may need a protective play space to protect them from the environment around them. This brings us to the idea of baby WASH, a new way of thinking about WASH for infants that is comprehensive and combines a protective play space to prevent the developing child from contamination, infant hand washing when outside of the play space, as well as caregiver hand washing with soap before preparing food and after using the toilet, and safe disposal of feces, water treatment, and avoiding feeding leftovers or reheating. In the last year, the SHINE Sanitation Nutrition Infant Nutrition Efficacy Study has begun in Zimbabwe, This is a 2x2 factorial design in which the nutrition intervention is a combination of a nutrition education intervention as well as delivery of NutriButter, and this integrated sanitation, hygiene, and wash intervention that I've described. The picture at the top here is a hand washing station. This one's actually homemade, but is part of the wash intervention. And this trial is looking to measure the independent and combined effects of wash and infant nutrition on stunting and anemia among children from birth to 18 months of age. And then on a subsample of HIV positive and negative infants, our objective is to measure this hypothesized causal pathway of environmental enteropathy. We recognize that this intervention to improve child growth and anemia is in the context of larger early childhood development, and that although we have many programmatic approaches for combining nutrition and early childhood development, integrating WASH in the three of them together is less well developed. And so one of our main goals is to work at integrating hygiene, social protection, stimulation, and nutrition to better serve proper infant development. And I'm going to leave you with what I see as our main research priorities for the upcoming year, is to identify the causal pathway by which WASH interventions may interrupt the environmental enteropathy pathway and child stunting, and also to develop and implement baby WASH interventions that support nutrition, hygiene, and child development. So I just want to recognize some of our other collaborators in this project. It's a big beast. The Ministry of Child Health and Welfare in Zimbabwe, two of our investigators our work with the Ministry of Child Health and Welfare. At Chitambo, Jean Humphrey, Nduduzi Mbuya, Naomi Kuda, and Robert. At Johns Hopkins, two of our investigators, Larry Moulton, Jim Tilsch, Cornell, Rebecca Stoltzfitz, University of London, Andrew Prendergast, and University of British Columbia, Amy Manges. And I also like to recognize our funders for this work, which Gates, DFID, CETA, NIH, Wellcome Trust, and UNICEF. So thank you, and I think we can take questions now.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura, and thank you, Helen, before Laura. If everyone could keep their microphones on mute, we actually have maxed out this room at 100 participants. We are recording it, so it'll be available to others later. But because of that, I think we're going to take all questions via the chat box. So if you have a question, if you could go ahead and type it in there. And maybe to get us rolling, Laura, if you could talk a little bit about if you were an NGO and implementing a new project based on what we're finding now, what sort of changes do you think you would make in a new project based on this information that maybe in the past we wouldn't have done or given as much emphasis to? If you could just speak to how do you feel like this should affect our work?
I think that at this point, what I've described to you is our ongoing work in the research community to be able to test these hypotheses for programs to be able to use. But if I were to flip over to a program, put my program hat on, I would encourage inviting more people to the table when you're developing interventions, and to think more holistically about child growth and child health in the context of these findings.
Thank you. And if Dr. Mubin, if you could please mute your mic. If you have a question, please type it in. Let's see. One of the questions that came in was, can you describe how to achieve a protected play space for infants and young children? And maybe along with that, Laura, you could say, how have you been able to balance having that protective play space, but not have it be so confining that then you end up with problems on the early childhood development side?
Yeah, I'm going to do my best to that. That in itself is a research question that we're working on right now. We have partnered with our early childhood development researchers here at Cornell, as well as our design and environmental analysis faculty and students here at Cornell, and are currently conducting formative research in Zimbabwe to develop a space that's culturally acceptable and supports early childhood development. So in January, we conducted focus group interviews with moms and showed them different place-based designs. And we currently have a design student. She just actually recently graduated, and she is working on the design phase for that work. So I think it's a process, an iterative process in which we're working with communities and with people that are extremely outside of my expertise in nutrition to make sure that we come up with something that is going to protect children.
Thanks, Laura. And this was something that came up at the Clean Fed and Nurtured conference, that kind of balance between making sure that children had a safe, protected play space, but not so confining that it might give us other problems. Emily Rand asked from the World Bank Water and Sanitation Program, did you observe how caregivers are disposing of their child's feces? And once again, Dr. Marbina, if you could mute, I'd appreciate it. Can you mute, please? Thank you. So maybe you could talk about that. Did you observe how caregivers are disposing of their child's feces?
Yeah, so with the infant feces, often the diapers, the nappies were being washed in that wash area, and the water was being just tossed, so it was contaminating the soil. So part of our intervention includes instructions on how to properly dispose of infant feces, and that being in the pit latrine that we're implementing.
Thanks. And Jesse Shapiro asked, will the presentation be made available? And I think on behalf of TOPS and working with Laura, we can definitely get this out to people and be posting it on the Food Security and Nutrition Network website. We'll type that. If you don't know about the Food Security and Nutrition Network website, we'll post that on in the chat box down here. The next question was from Sarah Summers with Traction. She said, related to the protected play space, was there consideration of a protected eating area for children, for example, off the ground for meal times?
So the children are often being fed in the same place that they're playing in. So what we're really working on now is creating a protective play space that is also washable. And when I say children are being fed where they're playing, I'm talking about children who are at the age where they can crawl around and get into trouble. Infants are obviously not being, the babies that aren't moving yet are not being fed on the ground. So we've tested several different non-confining structures, primarily having mats on the ground, but it's really important that they're washable because the kids will get dirty.
Okay, thank you very much. Some great questions are coming in here. If you do have questions, go ahead and open the chat box. As I mentioned, there's a little blue bubble that you'll see up at the top. You click on that and you're able to put your questions in there. Marianne LeBlanc asked, are there other pathogens in chicken feces that are a threat to children besides E. coli?
Yes, there are, and also an active source of research. One of the interesting things about how we conducted the formative research for this trial and how we've continued to extend our thinking about this problem is that what we've learned from the formative research and has just opened up more cans of worms. And whereas before we weren't even thinking about chickens, now we've started working on proposals to be able to identify what pathogens are in chicken feces and how that might affect infants. We're working with some vets at Cornell, some people in veterinary medicine. We recently have a student coming on board that specializes in chicken hygiene, and so I think we'll have more answers, but there are some potentially dangerous pathogens. E. coli itself is only dangerous if it's the toxigenic strain of E. coli. But all E. coli serves as a marker for feces.
Great. So it's a marker as well as being a problem in and of itself. And Laura, to follow up on that, I'm not sure if you're very familiar with what happened on the animal side in terms of growth, but I remember reading how one of the solutions that they found to this same problem with animal production and getting them to grow more for food was to regularly dose them with antibiotics. Now, that's not something we're proposing for children, but that is how I think they resolved some of this problem with animals.
Yeah, so that it's the dirty chicken hypothesis. I think at the very beginning of some of this environmental enteropathy work has to do with that. That when you dose chickens with antibiotics, they grow better, and so could we do the same with children? There actually are some studies going on looking at the effect of antibiotics on child growth, but in this context, we're really looking at cleaning up the environment.
Great. Mary DeCoster says, I'm so interested to learn that water wasn't that much of a problem. I seem to remember that FH did a study using water filters for decreasing diarrhea with good results. How does that fit? I'll lead off on that. What she's referring to is a randomized cluster trial that Food for the Hungry did in Bolivia with Sawyer water filters, where we saw a 72% reduction in diarrhea. Was this something, Laura, are water filters being used as part of this trial in China? It looked like a lot of the contamination actually was coming from water as well. And so I wanted to know if water filters were being considered as one of the interventions that we should be doing more with.
Yeah, every decision in this trial has resulted in a lot of debate and discussion about the appropriate way to move forward. And in the Shine trial, we're using Safeguard chlorination tablets for the water. So we're not ignoring water in the trial. But I think the point of that slide was not that water doesn't matter, but that we have these previously unexplored causes that seem to have much more of a fecal load in them than what we traditionally think of as a vector for contamination.
Excellent, thank you. And Jennifer Carson says, could you please clarify about cloth diaper cleaning over the pit latrine? Breastfed poop, at least for the first 6 months, just soaks into the diaper. I get scraping the solids into the latrine pot, but the diapers still need to be washed. How much contamination still remains when the scraped off diapers are washed? And if anyone could please mute your mic if you're talking right now. Thank you. Por favor. Sorry, Laura, we'll try to mute that mic. Okay. I think we got it taken care of. Go ahead.
That's a good question. So I think maybe my previous answer was a little bit superficial. One of the pieces of our intervention is proper disposal of the dirty water into the pit latrine or away from the compound. So I myself am not extremely familiar with the toxicity of the poop before 6 months of age, but our intervention really has to do with this proper disposal and washing.
Great, thank you. Genevieve Kelly with PSI says, what about separating the chickens, encouraging use of pins, et cetera? Is that feasible? Is that something that is being done in China?
Well, if you've ever had chickens, then you know the difficulty of getting chickens to stay out of anywhere. We have been working in combination in thinking about a protective play space with protective roost for the chickens, raised roost in which they might sleep in at night. There's additional problems with containing free-range chickens in small proximity to each other because it increases risk of disease transmission to the chicken. So it's something that's in process, but as far as putting up fences, that has been proved to be not possible in this context.
Thanks, Laura. And at Core Group, when Laura presented, we jokingly talked about chicken diapers. But believe it or not, there are chicken diapers available on the internet. It's for people in urban settings, mostly in industrialized countries. But I don't think we're going that direction. Dennis Lang mentioned that Salmonella and Campylobacter are commonly found in chicken poop. Thanks for that. Kate Golden says, have any studies looked at the effect on enteropathy of trying to introduce good bacteria into the gut via probiotics in any form?
Yes, there are. There's been quite a bit of work done with probiotics and celiac disease. So I don't know how familiar people are with celiac disease, but it mimics a lot of the same symptoms of what we're terming environmental enteropathy. It's another disease in which you have sort of blunting of the villi tips, decreased surface area of the gut. And there's clinically in the US, there's been studies looking at probiotics there that are suggestive that probiotics can help. From the field of microbiome, gut microbiome is just the launching off, and so I anticipate over the next couple of years the idea that we have this just colony in our gut, and that affects how we metabolize food and also how we are able to fight off microbes is going to gain increasing attention.
Great, thanks, Laura. And I know there are other substances like propolis, which bees make to seal their hives, that have been sold as a nutritional supplement that have antibiotic properties. It was actually called Russian penicillin for many years. So maybe we'll see some studies on that sort of thing at some point. Let's see. Some of the other, Marion LeBlanc said, yes, presumably other animals would be a problem, like free-range pigs or cattle, for example, or rats. Dr. Mubina said, in a developing country like Pakistan, where 60% of children have enteroviral infections, one of the reasons for persistent poliovirus in circulation. Your thoughts?
Okay, I missed that, so let me just find the question so I can look at it. Okay.
Saying, is this one of the reasons for persistent poliovirus that's being circulated by animals?
I cannot answer that question. I can give my thoughts on it. I know that right now there's been a lot of discussion about the rotavirus vaccine and implementing rotavirus, which is happening in Zimbabwe now. I'm not sure about Pakistan, but there's active research going on thinking about how environmental enteropathy might affect vaccine resistance. As far as poliovirus in the context of Pakistan, I don't think I can answer that.
Okay. Natalie Simoneau mentioned about the safe areas and promoting enclosed chickens into pens, but I believe we've already talked about that from one of the earlier questions that came up. Karen Taunta says, what are the intellectual and societal implications of a stunted population?
So I myself am short, but I'm not stunted. The intellectual results of stunting is that brain development isn't as good. So what you have at a population level is almost a brain drain because of poor nutrition during early infancy. So that's important both from a productivity standpoint, but also an ethical standpoint. So I guess that's how I would describe that.
Thanks. And Dr. Mubina mentions in Pakistan in the 2010 floods that they conducted a random study where they had two groups. One received nutrition supplements through CMAM, and one received pure water cleaning sachets and treated water with the other group and the other group used the same contaminated water they had been using. And they did a 4-month follow-up and found the group receiving water cleaning pure sachets at 30% less diarrhea and also a lesser time period, 3 months, to recover from malnutrition. So we're definitely seeing evidence of the benefit of doing water purification along with what we're talking about here, which is enclosing animals more. Anna Bowen says, I'm curious about the focus on the child's own stools. Generally, feces are not very harmful to the person they came from, since that person has already been exposed to the pathogens therein, though child stools are risky to others, of course. Will there be efforts to contain and safely dispose of other family members' stools?
Yes, the effort is for safe disposal of all stool in the household. The focus that I made on infant feces was really due to the mentality that infant stool was not as dangerous as other stools. And most of the households in which there's infants, there's other children running around, other young children, even other infants. So the focus will be on safe disposal of all stools. and with additional focus to overcome the barrier that we don't think it's dangerous.
Christoph Valengo mentioned, is a study you mentioned available? I do not remember if it was in Guatemala, that showed only 16% of studying would be explained by diarrhea, whereas 40% of the water by the water and sanitation.
Yeah, that study is available. I don't have the citation on my slide. I'm sorry about that, but I can send it out after. I don't know how. I can post it wherever we're posting.
Wonderful. Thanks, Laura. If others have questions, if you'd please type them into the chat box here. We've had some good discussion around this so far. Welcome to those of you who are coming in a bit later. We are just at the question and answer period, talking about environmental enteropathy. Laura has been answering questions for the last few minutes, and if anyone else has questions, we can post them in the chat box here. Laura, I don't know how involved you were with setting up these safe places for children to play, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, about some of the ideas that you rejected, what the general model is right now. I didn't know if you're using tarps or something else for flooring, or just mainly focusing on the sides of this thing, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I myself have not been extremely involved in the place-based development. I'm in nutrition, and a lot of my focus has to do with toxicology, but I can speak generally. About a year and a half ago, we started thinking about this idea of protected play spaces and tested some ready-made protective play spaces with different women in the communities to think about cultural acceptableness. In the U.S. right now, there's really adamant for and against for what we term playpens. But I have to remind people that this is a really different context from the U.S. and the use is for a very different reason. So what we found initially is that the bigger ones were more acceptable. Definitely lots of color, and there's a real need by families to have a place where their other children could interact with the infant that was being protected. So something that's big enough that the other children can play in it. Something that has things for the child to interact with. And so after some of the formative work that was done this year, there became a real interest in making it with locally available materials. One reason for this would be that these households are being selected for our study, but they're within a greater community, and that in which there might be other households that aren't selected for the study that might be interested in protecting their children as well. So we want something that communities can make themselves as well. So that's pretty much where we're at. As I said, we have a design team that's working on this, and hopefully we'll have. We already have a prototype, but hopefully we'll have some more news on that soon.
Thanks, Laura. A couple of new questions have come in. One is, given the recent study showing that rotavirus is the main cause of severe diarrhea in young children, do you think the rollout of rotavirus vaccine will reduce the potential impact of wash interventions on stunting?
I think our overall goal is to reduce stunting, and from some of the initial slides that I showed, we have a big black hole in which to fill as to the other non-dietary, specifically dietary causes of stunting. I think it's a really interesting time that that study that you're referring to is just fascinating, and we will be able to look at the interaction between rotavirus vaccine and water and sanitation and hygiene interventions, given that this rotavirus vaccine is being rolled out in around in many countries around the world right now. Um, it, I think that if rotavirus is a main contaminant in this population, and that wash interventions can prevent rotavirus, then it might change the effect size. But all in all, I think with the main goal to be reducing child stunting, the two interventions in combination are the best that we could have.
Great, thanks. Laura Bry asks, can you explain more about the IFG1 and BP3 and how this affects stunting?
Sure. So those are two markers that we're looking at for testing the causal pathway of the link between water sanitation and hygiene interventions and child stunting. We in a subset in about 1,600 of the infants, we're going to be collecting additional biomarkers to assess that whole causal pathway. So IGF-1 and the IGF binding protein 3 are two of the most proximal markers close to child growth. So they're at the downstream of that cascade. We've also looked at indicators of gut leakness. So looking at chasing whether microbes crossed from the lumen of the gut into the bloodstream. We have other markers of inflammation. So that's just one along the causal pathway, but it is a strong regulator of growth hormone, and growth hormone is the hormone that is controlling linear growth in children.
Thanks so much. Just a reminder, we have about 19 minutes left, so if you do have a burning question, please use the chat box there to write in your question. The next question is from Sarah Summers at Traction. She says, if child food showed little signs of E. coli contamination, what is the concern with feeding cold or reheated food?
Well, the cold or reheated food comes out of the more of a food safety mindset. So when you're eating cold food that hasn't been reheated, it might not have fecal contamination in it, but it might have bacteria that could cause illness in it. And so reheating food fully or not feeding old food could prevent some illness.
Great, thank you. And another question, it says, as you are in nutrition, can you speak a bit more about the microbiome and nutritional relation to things like lactobacilli in the gut, for example?
So we have someone that's working on microbiome with us in SHINE trial. That would be Amy Manges at University of British Columbia. And I guess all I can say is that it's an active area of research. That we're not dealing with probiotics in this population and are really observing what is happening.
Great, thanks. Emily Rand, once again with the World Bank Water and Sanitation Program, said, have you already developed promotional messages for safely disposing of child feces, and specifically the nappy disposal water that you mentioned earlier? And if so, could you share those with people?
That intervention has been developed and is currently being written up, and so I can say that should be coming out within the next 6 months, hopefully.
Thanks, wonderful. And we can make that available on the FSN Network website as well, and they can probably post it on the other WASH one that we mentioned. Sila Casoso said she wanted to share with everyone about an intervention that they developed on a WASH project's focus in Kenya that looked into safe disposal of children feces in rural areas, especially in areas where the latrine pit is commonly used. And she gives a website there that you can use. We can check that link and make sure that is active and useful. Dr. Mabina says, sometimes it's difficult to control the environmental sanitation and unhygienic surrounding conditions which the community as a whole can control. However, individually at the level of the household, through mothers' hand washing and safe water provision, can be very instrumental in reducing diarrhea and improve nutritional status. Your thoughts? So the question is, how much of this should we be trying to control it at the community level, and how much directly at the household level?
In the context of the SHINE trial, it's an efficacy study. So we're doing the best that we can to meet our goal to never let any of the children be exposed to feces throughout the first 18 months of age. It's not a programmatic study, and it's really to test the hypothesis that wash interventions can prevent environmental enteropathy and reduce stunting. The trial is being done at the household level. We are also doing promotional messages at the community level, but that's not the focus of the trial. Given that aside, I think that in a programmatic context, that you need to intervene at both the community and the household level.
Great, thanks, Laura. And I want to mention, if in fact you feel like you're suddenly booted off the call, we heard from a couple of people that said that they were dropped. I believe you can still use the same link to join back in. Marion LeBlanc says, presumably previous wash interventions didn't focus on safe play areas or on food. Will you be able to separate the effects of those additional interventions from the effects of more traditional wash interventions? Great question, Marianne.
Our wash intervention is being delivered as a package, but we are also conducting extensive formative research to look at the program impact pathway for how this intervention is affecting children. So I don't know that you'll see some sort of statistical analysis separating out the wash interventions, but we will be describing that in detail.
Wonderful. Okay, and Christophe Valingo says, regarding essential activities that one should promote to reduce undernutrition, either stunning or wasting and wash, is there any of these that could help? Household water treatment, hand washing, building and use of latrines in the view of your recent study. So I guess in part, the question is like, what should we be prioritizing from what you've seen in the data? Which of these should we be giving more emphasis to if you can't get everything done? Which are the ones you feel like we need to focus on the most?
Given that this is an area of active research, I don't know that we know the answer to that. I think that what we've learned is that paying more attention to the child's microenvironment is important, and thinking about it through a baby's eyes and what they're touching and what they're doing every day, and paying attention to that part of the environment.
Great. And a question for me is, we know that, do we know that what decreases diarrhea almost certainly decreases environmental enteropathy? I know that we know that just doing things, that there's some things that reduce environmental enteropathy probably that won't necessarily lead to a difference in diarrhea. So can you speak to that?
Sure, I will do my best. Environmental enteropathy is a subclinical condition of the intestine, and that changes the way that the intestine is interacting with the environment, with both toxins and feces and food. Whereas diarrhea, as this most recent study found, is the largest cause is rotavirus, and then there's 4 other common causes of diarrhea. So the causes of diarrhea are largely infectious pathogens, whereas the causes of enteropathy may not be. It doesn't mean that interventions to clean up the environment would have a beneficial effect on both environmental enteropathy as well as diarrhea, but if the biological pathways are different, so you wouldn't expect for removal of one to remove the other.
Great, thanks. And another question as we wait for maybe a few more questions to come here in the chat box. If anyone has another question they'd like to ask, we still have a few more minutes. Laura, you're a nutritionist. That's your area that you come from. But one thing that I've really been concerned about with this is a lot of organizations don't necessarily have a wash person or have a wash person in the field. It's similar to social behavior change. Some people will learn about it, but it's often the nutrition person doing social behavior change or the the agriculture person doing social behavior change, but they want to have a specialist in that area. This is something that could fall through the cracks a bit if nutritionists felt like, well, WASH isn't my area, because they've traditionally focused more on intake. As you've worked more and more in this, have you felt that that could be a problem? Do some people say, wait a minute, that's WASH, that's not nutrition? Or are you hearing a lot of acceptance that we need to do more in WASH, even though it's not traditionally something that we put within nutrition?
I come from a group of people who are kind of brainwashed on this topic. We almost all of us started as nutritionists and somehow became WASH people along the way. I do, as far as within the research community, this is a new-ish area. I mean, it's definitely a boomingly emerging hypothesis. I think that the infrastructure for collaboration across sectors is still largely does not exist intellectually or programmatically, and so that we need to be able to build platforms at different levels, whether it's research or programmatic.
Great. I think this is a very important question, and we just have to remind ourselves too, and maybe even use this when promoting it, that there's been great information and new technologies that come out that are roundly ignored for many years, decades sometimes, because they kind of don't fit with what people want to do. Atul Gawande had some great posts lately where he talked about why certain things are picked up and why other things are ignored or even shunned when new ideas come for how we can do things better. So I'd encourage you to read about that. Jennifer Platt said, how can we get the WASH sector to increase coordination with health and nutrition to address these interlinked issues? And then Marianne mentioned, or how can we get nutrition people to address WASH? I've been roundly ignored trying to talk to nutrition people, being a WASH person herself. And Jennifer Karstner said, not to mention ag people, this should be a part of ag activities. So I guess the question is, what are some ways, and we might have responses online as well. You can type in your suggestions in the chat box of how do we have better integration and how do we get nutrition people more interested in WASH, given what we're seeing in the data here. And I don't know if you have something you want to share on that, Laura, before we see if we have some responses online as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you what we're a research organization that is a combination of different universities, and what we're trying to do is provide evidence for or against this hypothesis that WASH interventions can prevent this environmental enteropathy and then prevent stunting. That as researchers, evaluating that hypothesis will help other researchers determine what the relationship is between WASH and nutrition. As far as a programmatic, I mean, I think also these types of studies help programmatic people decide upon priorities and how their organization is going to support those priorities. And I think also the arenas like this webinar today and this group help us come together and learn some of the same languages. So which is one really big barrier to working across sectors is not understanding the lingo that they're using or what their priorities are.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there can be some competition at times, too, between sectors that we really have to work on. Early on, I remember Food for the Hungry was suggesting that we consider deworming farmers and giving them iron as a way to increase productivity. We felt like there's good data there that it could help. The ag people said, that's a health intervention. You can't put it here. The health people said, that's an ag intervention. It doesn't work with mothers and young children, so you can't put it here. And effectively kept us from actually even testing out the idea very much. Jennifer said, as a nutritionist, I have to note, and all of HKI are completely on board with the importance of WASH. There shouldn't be any silos. Helen, I think this would be a great place for you to step in and maybe say, from the point of view of a donor, how can we get people to pay attention to this and also to achieve better integration from your point of view?
So that's a really good question, and I think the community of practice that we've established was hoping to have an intellectual exchange between the two. I know that isn't programmatic, but at least to have people start to talk about how WASH could be used to integrate into nutrition programs and provide a platform to have that discussion. So I know there'll be upcoming discussions about how programs might integrate, but I think we need to have an intellectual discussion about what would be the best points of integration before we move out to programming. So if you have ideas about this, perhaps we could start a more interactive session on the community of practice and take input from a wide variety of people as we try to formulate those ideas. And I'll work with WASH Plus and Dan Campbell to establish that so we can start that interaction.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen. Mary DeCoster added, it's a tough shift of paradigm, and she thinks it's important to assure nutritionists that we aren't throwing out the baby out with the bathwater. Adequate intake and breastfeeding, complementary feeding remain important, and it's important to be aware of gut health and preventing feces ingestion. So I think that is important. Assuring nutrition folks that what they have been working on is very important. We need to continue working on that, but we need to make space for these WASH interventions, knowing the sort of effect they're having. Any other questions? Feel free to type it into the chat box here. And if not, Helen, would you like to close us out just to mention any last comments on this? Sorry, I don't hear Helen's audio yet. Helen, are you there?
I am there. Am I connected now?
Yes, go ahead.
So I just wanted to state that I hope this is the beginning of a much longer dialogue about environmental enteropathy and the importance of WASH in nutrition programs, and that we'd like to continue this with a quarterly webinar. So if there are people who would like to chime in or have a space to talk about perhaps their results, we could do that in the next quarterly webinar and perhaps have several short presentations to address some of the issues that were raised today. So I'd like to see this as a continuing dialogue and see this as a starting point, not as a closure.
I agree, Helen.
Back over to you.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate your attending this and for your comments. And Laura, thanks so much for presenting this great new information to us. On behalf of the TOPS program and also the Food Security Nutrition Network, we thank you for your participation, and please share the link with others who were unable to attend. We did max out at 100, so there are people that would have liked to attend that couldn't have. So thanks so much, and keep